your spiritual journey, you are welcome here. Can you hear? Are you sure? Are you here? Are you sure? Hardest thing in spiritual practice? Many of you get Father Richard Rohr's daily meditations delivered to your email every day. If you don't, they're quite free. You can just go on Center for Action and Contemplation and sign up for them. They don't take long to read, and I read them as part of my usual morning practice. And last Sunday, well after I had finished writing what I would speak from, sometimes I stay with the text and sometimes I don't, I was struck by the wonderful bit of divine entanglement that was in Father Rohr's morning meditation beginning last Sunday. Here's one of my two favorite pictures of me and Rohr. And in case you can't read the caption on the shirt I'm wearing, it says, Jesus loves you, but I'm his favorite. And Rohr said to me, you know, Bill, the problem is you really believe that. So Rohr is, beginning last Sunday, writing emails, daily meditations, frequently shared by Jim Finley and Cynthia Bourgeot in his desire to rebuild the church from the bottom up, which is typical for a Franciscan, because you remember Francis heard God say, Francis, rebuild my church. And the debate among Franciscan historians has been, did that message mean rebuild this particular church in Assisi, or rebuild the church? And so the Franciscans have been building the church. That meditation last week began with a saying that is one of the true, authentic sayings of Jesus, and I'm sure you will remember it distinctly because it was one of the very first sayings in a book I've been meaning to mention to you, the Gospel of Thomas. And in the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus begins, after saying what the Gospel of Thomas is about, by saying, I have come to set fire upon the earth, and how I wish it were already blazing. So a version of that is right at the beginning of the Thomas collection. I want to read it to you the way that Eugene Peterson translates it. I have come to start a fire on this earth. How I wish it were blazing right now. I've come to change everything, to turn everything upside down, everything right side up. How I long for it to be finished. Do you think that I came to smooth things over, to make everything nice? Not so. I have come to disrupt and comfort.
Confront.
I mean,
confront.
I don't think that would be a good sign to put on the outside of the church. Come Sunday for disruption and confrontation. So a few weeks ago, the Roman Catholic side of Christianity and the Christian side of Christianity, not the Eastern side, celebrated the 500th anniversary of what is referred to as the Protestant Reformation. And like many terms that get applied to groups like Methodists, John Wesley was the first to use a phrase about the group called Methodist, and it was used as a derisive term. And Protestant was used first as a derisive term. You know those scalawags who were protesting everything? And then it came to be taken officially as the Protestant. In 1517, the church was about as corrupt as an institution could be. And the straw that broke the camel's back was a Dominican preacher named Johann Tetzel. He headed up a very clever marketing program for the church called the Selling of Indulgence. And an indulgence was something that you could buy that first got your loved ones out of purgatory earlier, and then you could buy an indulgence to get yourself out of purgatory, and then, and this is a really clever idea, you could buy an indulgence for a sin you had not yet committed.
Prepaid.
Pay as you go. Yeah.
And you can imagine this is a really lucrative business. And it was alleged that the money from the sale of indulgences went for the building and rebuilding of St. Peter's in Rome. But the fact is that most of the money went to pay off debts for Tetzel's boss in his run to get appointed as archbishop. It's a very political situation there. So there was this monk in the Catholic Church, Martin Luther, who got very upset about Tetzel's work, and he posted 95 theses in the square in Wittenberg, and 2 of the 95 theses that Martin Luther posted were directly against the sale of indulgence. I'll read you one of them. I mean, you probably know these already. But Thesis 27. They preach only human doctrines who say that as soon as the money clinks in the money chest, the soul flies out of purgatory. Now, Tetzel's life ended in not only disrepute, but he is most remembered among people who remember this sort of thing for coming up with this couplet, and this is something that I remembered from seminary. You have to forgive my cough. As soon as the gold in the casket rings, casket was the little silver box, the rescued soul to heaven springs. Had a ring about it. So I want to give one more note before moving on to the importance of being open to what Luther was about, which is constant reformation, not only internally but externally. You know, Protestants have had a tendency to idealize and glamorize Martin Luther. He did a mighty thing, taking on the establishment of his day. There is no doubt about that. But what people are not aware of is that toward the end of his life, Martin Luther became a rabid anti-Semitic.
Oh.
And as a matter of fact, Adolf Hitler quoted Martin Luther in his effort to get rid of the Jews.
Oh.
And we don't often lift that part of Luther's life up. I think all institutions need to be open to continual reformation, because in order to stay afloat, institutions can easily lose sight and integrity. After we have accomplished the survival and security needs, we have to be open to ongoing revision of our lives. Well, if you have something to protect, that's very difficult to do. And if you are an institution, you don't want to do something that, thank you, do something that's going to offend people with money. That's why a lot of things cannot be talked about in church. I remember one of my early theology professors, when we naive students would bring up criticisms about the church, he would say something like, yes, the church is a prostitute, and she is my mother. Phyllis Tickle, who's written a great book on the re-emergence of Christian forms in our time, she died a few years ago. She says, we eventually elaborate, encrust, and finally embalm our institutions with the accretion of both fervor and our silliness. At that point, there is no hope for either religion or society, save only to knock the whole thing off ourselves and start all over again. I don't have a crystal ball that allows me to predict the future. I do know that the trend in the Western world is for church attendance to be going down. 4,000 churches a year close their doors in the United States. We have 1,000 startups, but that doesn't offset what's going down. And the PR about what it means to be Christian in the world is not looking good either. I think there are a lot of reasons for this. Institutional rigidity, an abysmal ignorance of religious tradition in the Bible that I mentioned last week. I'm going to continue that today. And by that, I mean an ignorance about what we call so easily the Word of God, how that grew and developed over centuries. We don't, as the expression goes, need to throw out the baby with bathwater. Standing with Jesus, which is the theme of this current series, means standing with the truth. The truth that will set us free. Truth anywhere is truth everywhere. Truth is inclusive and universal. When I speak about the rigidity of the Christian church, I am not unmindful how many people over the centuries have been severely wounded by organized religion. I'm not talking just about the Crusades and things like that. I'm talking about the fact that there are people in this room who have been profoundly hurt by an institution they thought they could trust. They have been hurt by clerics they thought they could trust. There are at least 3 groups of people in this room who come from other churches who have been either explicitly or implicitly told that the people I so freely quote in here, John Shelby Small, Marcus Borg, John Dominic Crossan, and others, that they cannot read or study those books in their churches. And I hear stories like that all the time from other churches. You can't read that in this church. So I have given the theme to the direction I want to take in here for the foreseeable future, standing with Jesus. And in our time, there are trustworthy voices seeking and encouraging us to listen to the teachings of Jesus and follow him simply rather than believing in Jesus in order to get a fire insurance policy for the next world. The Christianity that I grew up with was just really a kind of softer version of what Tetzel was preaching. You believe this, and you got an escape clause. So a very quick summary of last week, and you're probably going to hear this in more different ways as we go forward. And I plan to put a summary of this on the website. The defining questions for the human spiritual journey are God, who are you? And God, who am I? And those questions are said to be the ones that St. Francis asked over and over. God, who are you? Who am I? I hope you recognize that these are the questions that came from the Hebraic tradition. They were put in a communal sense, and you can almost say that every word that we have in the Hebrew Scriptures is an effort to answer one of these two questions. God, who are we? And how are we to live? Those are matters of identity and destiny. And the two big barriers in answering these questions are organized religion and the Bible, or some misunderstanding or misuse of both. So what I want to do today is to offer you a teaching of Jesus. We're going to stand with Jesus, remember? And I want you to see how this teaching has been misused, and then what its applicability might be for you and for me. This is a teaching found only in Luke. Jesus told them a story showing that it was necessary for them to pray consistently and never quit. He said, there was once a judge in some city who never gave God a thought and cared nothing for people. A widow in that city kept after him. My rights are being violated. Protect me. He never gave her the time of day, but after this went on and on, he said to himself, I care nothing what God thinks, even less what people think. But because this widow won't quit badgering me, I better do something and see that she gets justice. Otherwise, I'm going to end up beaten black and blue by her pounding. Then the master said, do you hear what that judge, corrupt as he is saying? So what makes you think God won't step in and work justice for his chosen people who continue to cry out for help? Won't he stick up for them? I assure you he will. He will not drag his feet. But how much of that kind of persistent faith will the Son of Man find on earth when he returns? Now, I know you know this, but it is helpful to remember that there are very smart people who should know this but don't. Namely, the Bible didn't just fall out of the sky in the form that we have it now. It came in bits and pieces and was assembled over a long period of time. The Hebrew Scriptures particularly, which shaped what those who followed Jesus wrote, they were developed over centuries in blocks. Not in the chronological order that we have them in the Hebrew Scripture, but very, very, very different. And these writings were written for three things. They were written to explain to a nomadic, tribal people who they were, where they had come from, and when enduring the harshest of circumstances, what they could hope for the future. Who they were, where they had come from, and what they could hope for the future. Those three things. Now, in one of these periods of time, when things were chaotic and the Jewish people were in exile, they needed something to give the Jews identity. So they made all these rules and regulations that would separate the Jews from other people. Those rules had to do with things like eating, with things like circumcision. If you eat a kosher meal, you're not going to eat with other people. So you're not likely to intermarry. And they had all these rules, all these regulations about when you could work, what work constituted, and all that sort of stuff. And in order to make sure that these rules and regulations were followed, they wrote a couple of books, Leviticus and Deuteronomy, that have all the rules in them, rules for a specific people at a specific time, They weren't written to oppose gay people in the 19th and 20th century. They were written for those people at a particular time. And in order to keep these rules and regulations in place, they needed officers to enforce them. So they created a body of officers called judges. Now, the role of a judge among the Jewish people was to maintain harmony and community and to adjudicate disputes fairly and impartially. And in Jewish law, it was of the utmost importance that the judge ensure protecting the rights of the poor, particularly the rights of widows and orphans and refugees. Every Jew who heard this story would know this. So they knew from the beginning they were hearing a story about a bad judge. This guy from the get-go is described as a bad guy. You wonder why he even took the office. He didn't seem to know what it was about. He had no idea of justice. He certainly had no idea of compassion. And we make this judgment because of his actions or lack of actions. The widow had to go before him again and again and again and again and again, pleading her case, and again and again and again and again she was told no. But incredibly, she was not deterred. She kept on going back. And she kept on going back. And she kept on going back. I remember when I first got seriously involved in the meditation practice called the 10-Day. At the end of it, the teacher said, the thing that matters most about your meditation practice is persistence and patience. You must be persistent and patient in the practice. And this widow was that. She was persistent and she was patient. And so she begins to get on the judge's nerves. And we know this because as part of the story, Jesus tells us something of his internal dialogue. He says, look, I could care less about God. I sure don't care about anybody else. But this widow is standing on my very last nerve. So fine, I will give her what she wants so that she will finally let me alone. Got it? That's the story. Now, every parable that Jesus told was designed to upset people. There's nothing upsetting in this parable. We have this nice, neat, sweet story of a woman who pestered a judge until she got what she wanted. And the way this parable is told, and the way it has been interpreted ever since Luke recorded it, indeed, whoever put this particular story of Jesus in the record did us a disservice by interpreting it before the parable is ever read. Jesus told them a story showing that it was necessary for them to pray consistently and never quit. All you have to do is bug God day after day, night after night. Don't stop. Don't give up. All prayers will eventually be answered. Not because God wants to, but God just wants to get you off her back. Now, I've said on more than one occasion, I have seen more people give up on the religious spiritual journey for this than any other single thing. People have prayed to be spared some calamity, or short of that, to be empowered to endure one. They don't feel their prayers are answered, so to heck with this religious thing. To heck with this God. I'm done. I try my best to put into practice what I teach in here about peace, love, and joy. I pray for it. I work for it. I long for it. I talk about it. And yet every day I hear about another shooting, another miscarriage of justice, another wrong committed either by our government or by some religious group. And if this parable is designed to encourage our persistence with God, then frankly, I don't see any good for it. I don't think God as a vending machine is a good concept of God that I can give myself to. Now, standing with Jesus means, among other things, working past the damage done by organized religion and working past misunderstanding of the Bible. And this parable is a perfect example. So I know you might be able not to see this all the way from the back, but I'm going to give you the best that biblical scholarship has to offer about this parable. This is a page from the 5 Gospels. And the 5 Gospels say that this corrupt judge parable appears only in Luke. There are no other parallels in any other source, and that is oddly one of the indications that what is contained here is an authentic teaching of Jesus. The fact that it's only one place. And some scholars use a passage like this to attest to the fact that Luke borrowed from another source that we don't have. Based on a lot of things that we're not going to go into right now, everything in black in the particular edition of the 5 Gospels, the scholars are confident Jesus did not say. So Jesus did not say this introduction about a parable about praying at all times not to lose heart. And he didn't say this down here about God giving justice to his chosen one. All Jesus said was this parable right here. Now remember, parables are designed to upset us, to confront us. I want to read you just what's in red. Once there was a judge in this town who feared neither God nor cared about people. In that same town was a widow who kept coming to him and demanding, "Give me a ruling against the person I'm suing." For a while he refused, but eventually he said to himself, "I'm not afraid of God and I don't care about people, but this widow keeps pestering me, so I'm going to give her a favorable ruling, or else she'll keep coming back till she wears me down." Now remember, parables are meant to be disruptive. Parables are meant to be provoking. Jesus was disruptive. He was provoking. So what would make this parable disruptive and provoking? And once I tell you, it's going to be so obvious. We switch roles. We don't assume that we are the widow and God is the judge. We assume that we are the judge and God is the widow. What happens if we sit in the seat of the unjust God, judge, and God takes on the persistent cries of the widow? Now, you may not like this turn of events. We might argue that we have nothing in common with this unfaithful, unjust, disrespectful judge. But just sit with it for a moment and listen. Through this widow, God comes to those in power. That's us, even though we may not feel it. And God says, "I want justice for my people. And I'm going to keep bugging you until you respond." Again and again, no matter how many times your collective words say no, I intend to wear you down. My hope is to wear you down with grace, but by God, I'm going to get to you. That is the function of the unconscious, by the way, to get our attention. We push it aside, get our attention, push it aside, comes back up. Unconscious continues to say, listen to me, or I'm going to give you an addiction, make you have an accident, make you have an affair, make you depressed, but I'm going to get your attention. So God keeps coming back and keeps coming back. Our persistent, stubbornly determined God keeps challenging us to let the priorities of God's compassion and justice reorder the priorities of our lives, of our life, of my life, of your life. And nobody likes the persistent widow in their face all the time. So we have ways of tuning out. You know, by their very nature, reckonings are painful, disorienting. Our media seems full every day of stories of men of power, wealth, fame, and accomplishment being exposed for sexual misconduct of one sort or another. Some are being held accountable, some are not. I did not mention it at the beginning because somebody else took care of that, but last Sunday, I figured that I ought to practice what I preach, and so we went home and for the second time watched The Mask You Live In. And then the next night, for the first time, we watched the earlier documentary, Misrepresentation. And after watching those films, and you'll have to answer this for yourself, I wondered how I have been complicit by ignoring or accepting what is going on with men in our culture, with what is being done against women in our culture. One of the most sexist institutions on the planet, outside the Senate and Congress. It's true.
The president.
Is organized religion of all kinds. In many branches of organized religion, women cannot serve at all. And yet, women are 51% of our population. We devolve into tribalism rather than asking and standing up for wise and useful answers to the question, who are we and how are we to live? And what we're confronting should transcend partisan point scoring. Joan Chittister says, our culture lives with one leg tied to the other. We try to walk on one leg. Now, I believe that we are in the midst of a great turning, a watershed moment. I'm reminded of a line Woody Allen wrote. Woody Allen said, more than any other time in history, mankind faces a crossroads. One path leads to despair and utter hopelessness, the other to total extinction. Let's pray we have the wisdom to choose correctly. Surely there's got to be another path. We have an opportunity to stand with and for the values that lead to our bringing enlarged being to the world. And let's hope that we don't waste it. Let's listen to the widow's voice out there. I want in my own way to stand with Jesus, and I want to present his teaching. I want to be provocative enough and disruptive enough and funny enough to get away with it. But I want to show how easily organized religion, especially for those who stand in the Christian tradition and who misunderstand the Bible, how we can get in the way of the very thing that we say we want. Jesus shows us a way to be. And this is hard to see because we get so easily trapped by our dualistic minds. Jesus doesn't stand against culture. That's the line in the sand that we like to draw in our culture. Who decides who is in and who is out? There is so much of this in our world today. Nor does Jesus stand with culture. That's the mindless stance that says, my tribe told me this is true, I believe it, that settles it. That's mindless, uncritical conformity. Jesus consistently stands with the excluded, the outsider, the poor, the stranger, the unseen, the unwanted. And that way he demonstrates a freedom from every local culture. This is his way of critiquing all self-serving culture and his way of standing with everyone all at the same time. It's what puts him outside any status quo thinking, any establishment thinking. Organized religion has, for the most part, been about sin management. This is true way before Jesus came on the scene. It was one of the things he was upset against. Jesus was upset about anyone who left themselves out of the sin equation. You just read the narratives for yourself and see what you find out. Jesus was never upset at sinners. He was only upset at people who thought they weren't. Jesus spent most of his time standing with the excluded, the unworthy, the so-called bad people, and the only way he tries to change them is by loving them, healing them. And that's so much harder than trying to fix or understand or control. It's easier to be politically correct. It's easier to be religiously correct. Jesus did not give people answers. He stood with them. He said, come follow me. Come see where I live. And he calls us to build a world where a person can live more fully, love more wastefully, and be all that God intends for each person to be. So I think that we have been called to oppose any and everything that diminishes the life of any single human being, whether that's race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, or religion itself. That's what I see Jesus to have done. And because he did it, and did exactly that, people were able to see and meet and experience God in him in a radically new way. And that's what I think it means to stand with Jesus. When I was growing up, and God, I am so grateful for the church in which I did grow, I learned so much. But the question that I heard frequently was, have you been born again? And I worked at that, having a personal relationship with Jesus. It was decades before I realized that taken at the level that it was meant, being born again represented a state of chronic dependency. What we need, pardon me, I have to what we need is not to be born again. What we need is to grow up. I've been asked to appear on a panel by the Journal of Contemporary Theology that we were talking about next year. And the topic is salvation. And I wondered if any of the people who come to hear me are worried about salvation. What does it mean to be saved? Are you saved? My hunch is, pardon me, and part of this is because the church has not been willing to keep up with what's going on in the field of science. Most people out there, maybe even some of you, have a view of God as up there, out there, and even worse, a God as a punishing God. That's going to get you. God's mostly interested in what happens to people when they die, except those who accept Jesus. In that case, Jesus is going to accept your punishment for you. I mean, you could see how a guy like John Tetzel would have a market. Making people feel and be guilty and then providing the way out, that enriches the church. Way church maintain power. And maybe this is the reason so many religious people have become so unloving, so judgmental, so eager to get others to stand where they stand. I understand misery loves company. I've said this before, lightning didn't strike, I didn't get fired, I'll say it again. Jesus did not die for your sins. He did not die for my sins. That theological nonsense just breeds more violence. Connected to this misunderstanding of who we are is the mythical notion that there was once a time where there was a perfect creation and we fell away from it. So that notion set the stage for a guilt-producing, dependency-seeking, neurotic religion. There is all the difference in the world between the notion of fallen creatures and incomplete creatures. Neither our parents, as represented by mythical Adam and Eve, nor we did anything to get us kicked out of a Garden of Eden that never existed. The distortions that exist in us and in our world are the result of the unfinished nature of our humanity. I personally don't think we yet know what it means to be human. We've clearly not achieved it. But what is it, I believe, God is bugging us to pay attention to? What is it that God wants us to respond to? We don't need some divine rescue to lift us from a fall that never happened and restore us to a status we never possessed. What we are called to produce in the world is a wholeness. What we are called to do in the world is to love. To be saved does not mean to be rescued. It means to be empowered, to be something we have not yet been able to be. I truly believe that Jesus, just as he did for some of those who first experienced him, can provide us with true liberation in our ongoing effort to answer the question, God, who are you? God, who am I? God, who are you? God, who am I? And this is challenging work because when it comes to Jesus, nobody in here starts with a clean slate. You doubt that. You just go to work tomorrow and say the word Jesus to a colleague. You just stepped on a landmine. See what happens. If you were raised in a Christian context, Jesus is likely either a sweetly sentimental, white, blonde, tall, blue-eyed Scandinavian guy, or he is appallingly guilt-inducing. If you were not raised in a Christian context, you may very well have experienced Jesus as negative or threatening because, sadly, over centuries, institutional Christianity has used Jesus as a battering ram to club the rest of the world into submission. And even if neither of these reactions apply to you, it is impossible in Western culture to live without some notion of Jesus. We are already into the Christmas season, where myths and misunderstandings abound. We'll get into some of those next week. I wanted to begin the way I did today with this delightfully deceptive story in Luke to demonstrate how easy it is to mishear Jesus. All the teachings about him actually can get in the way of our not encountering him. I think a lot of people who call themselves Christian live with a false sense of security that they would recognize him if he showed up. And further, that he would bless our way of doing things. But there's something much, much more insidious about the familiarity we have with Jesus. And this familiarity blunts the tool we need most to connect with the wisdom of Jesus, and that's the power of inner recognition. For those original followers who first heard Jesus, following him was anything but safe. The political and religious leaders were put off by him. Even those closest to him didn't know how to pigeonhole him. Was he a healer, a prophet, a political revolutionary, a wandering mystic, a long-awaited Messiah? None of the above. And most of all, for all of them, the future was unseen. They didn't know about resurrection. They didn't know about crucifixion. So what made them say yes to this God? And whatever that quality is, that's what I'm shooting for in these teachings. Whatever the future of Western organized religion will be, I don't know. You can't keep an institution from changing. I do know that we live in a rapidly changing world, a world that is changing in many, many ways. The globalization that is occurring is something that seems to be happening that no one is directing, controlling, limiting. Our task in the midst of it is to listen. Standing with Jesus means to hear and respond to the cries we hear for justice and compassion. Not for the people we understand, like, who are part of our political party, our tribe, but particularly for the widows, the orphans, the outcasts, the strangers. And like that widow, I think God's going to keep bugging us. And if I understand the story, if we fail to respond, there will be hell to pay. I don't mean hell in some afterlife. I mean just hell in the future that we are building for ourselves. So this is a very personal question. What's God bugging you about? If you say it is your desire to stand with Jesus, what do you think God is persistently calling you to do? To say? What is it that God is not going to leave you alone about? Can you hear? As you leave here today and go into the living of your life this week, I invite you to open your ears and eyes and your heart to what God is bugging you about. How's the sacred persistently challenging you to allow peace, love, and joy to reorder the priorities of your life? Now, you and I can choose to stand in the stance of the unjust judge, or we can respond to the call as demonstrated through the persistent call for justice in the widow, call for justice and compassion. It's all a matter of how and to whom we pay attention. Can you hear? Are you here? Are you sure? No matter where you go this week, no matter what happens, remember this: you carry precious cargoes, so watch your step, and I will see you here next Sunday. Thank you.